It was the kind of Saturday morning that begged for a slow start. Soft sunlight stretching across the city skyline, the hum of traffic muffled by the gentle rustle of early autumn leaves. Richard Hale had woken before his alarm, not because he needed to be anywhere, but because Sophie had crept into his room at dawn, tapping his shoulder with that patient insistence that only an 8-year-old could manage. She stood there in her pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep, holding up a small spiral notebook where she'd drawn a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of pancakes. Beneath it, in neat block letters, she'd written, "Café, please." He'd smiled. How could he not? Sophie didn't often initiate plans. Most mornings, she was content to curl up with a book or sketch quietly by the living room window. But this morning was different. She wanted to go somewhere. Half an hour later, they stepped out into the crisp air, Sophie's small hand tucked into his. The sidewalks were still damp from last night's drizzle, and a faint aroma of baking bread drifted from somewhere up the street. The neighborhood cafe was only a few blocks away, a place Richard had been to a handful of times for quick meetings, but rarely for leisure. As they walked, Richard felt the familiar gap between them, a space not of love but of language. Sophie had been born mute, her vocal cords underdeveloped from a rare condition. She communicated entirely through sign language, a skill he had barely scratched the surface of learning. Business had been his excuse. Endless meetings, investor calls, travel. But the truth gnawed at him. He had never carved out the time to truly meet her in her world. Still, Sophie didn't seem to hold it against him. She was quiet but affectionate, and every now and then, she squeezed his hand as if to say she was happy just to be here. They reached the cafe, its big bay windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. A bell chimed as they stepped through the door, and Richard was met with the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans, mingled with something sweet, perhaps cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. The place was small but inviting. Wooden tables sat under strings of warm Edison bulbs, and the chatter of morning regulars blended with the hiss of the espresso machine. Sophie immediately spotted an empty table in the far corner, next to a wall lined with shelves of second-hand books. She pointed toward it, her eyes bright. Richard nodded, letting her slide into the booth while he shrugged off his coat. She pressed her palms against the table, scanning the cafe with curiosity. He noticed her gaze linger on the counter where a young waitress in a forest green apron was taking orders. She moved with a calm efficiency, her smile genuine as she chatted with the customers. Richard pulled out his phone to check a few emails, an old reflex, but Sophie tapped the table sharply, drawing his attention back. She mimed a stern look, then pointed to his phone, shaking her head. He chuckled under his breath, slipping it into his pocket. She was right. A moment later, the waitress approached their table. "Good morning," she said warmly, her voice carrying over the low hum of the cafe. She introduced herself as Ava, her eyes flicking to Sophie with a smile that seemed to soften even more. And then, without missing a beat, she lifted her hands and began to sign. "Good morning. Would you like pancakes or waffles?" Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes widening in shock. And then in joy. Her small hands flew into motion, signing back so quickly that Richard could barely follow. He didn't need to understand the words to recognize the delight radiating from her face. Richard sat frozen, his heart tightening in a way he hadn't expected. In less than a minute, this stranger had crossed a bridge he had been staring at for years but never dared to walk. Ava's hands moved with an ease and rhythm that spoke of years, not months, of practice. Each gesture was deliberate yet fluid, like a language she carried in her bones. Sophie's face had transformed. The reserved little girl Richard knew was gone, replaced by someone vibrant, animated, almost overflowing with words that didn't need sound. Richard found himself watching them as though from outside the moment, as if the cafe had faded into a soft blur and all that remained was the two of them. His daughter and this stranger speaking in a world he had only skirted the edges of. Sophie signed quickly, her fingers nimble, her eyes lighting up with every response Ava gave. They were laughing, silently but fully, their expressions doing as much talking as their hands. He realized, with a pang, that he had never seen Sophie laugh like that. Not with him. Ava glanced at Richard between exchanges, a polite acknowledgement that he was still part of the table, but she didn't slow for his sake. Instead, she let Sophie lead, letting the little girl's voice, her real voice, take up space. When Sophie signed something that made Ava tilt her head back in silent laughter, Richard felt a strange mix of pride and shame. Pride because Sophie was so bright, so expressive. Shame because he had never created the space for her to show it. When Ava finally turned to take their order, she spoke aloud for Richard's benefit, her tone warm but professional. "Pancakes for Sophie, yes? And for you?" Richard ordered coffee and an omelet, but his mind wasn't on food. He found himself studying Ava. The gentle way she placed the order pad in her apron pocket. The subtle nod she gave Sophie before stepping away. There was no pity in her manner, no awkwardness. She wasn't treating Sophie as a challenge to be navigated. She was treating her as a person to be understood. Sophie watched Ava walk back toward the counter, her hands resting on the edge of the table as if she were already rehearsing the next thing she wanted to say. She turned to Richard and began signing quickly, her brows lifted in excitement. He caught friend and fun. 2 words he actually knew, but the rest flew past him. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he murmured, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "You're going too fast for me." Her expression dimmed, just slightly. Not enough to break the moment, but enough to make something inside him twist. As they waited for their food, Richard's eyes wandered to the rest of the café. It was lively but not crowded, filled with the low hum of conversations and the clinking of cups on saucers. Yet somehow, Sophie and Ava's earlier exchange had made the whole place feel smaller, more intimate. When Ava returned with their plates, she didn't just set the pancakes down in front of Sophie. She signed "Enjoy" and "maple syrup" before sliding a little pitcher toward her. Sophie responded with a rapid flurry of signs that Richard couldn't catch, but Ava nodded, smiled, and even acted out an exaggerated chef's bow, making Sophie giggle again. As Ava moved on to another table, Richard watched her go, wondering how, in a single morning, she had made his daughter feel more heard than he had in years. He didn't know then that this wouldn't be the last time they'd see her. For the rest of their breakfast, Richard felt less like a participant and more like an observer in a conversation he couldn't join. Sophie's world, so alive in the rapid movements of her hands and the unspoken warmth of her eyes, seemed to open effortlessly in Ava's presence. He watched Sophie sign with an energy that was almost startling. She wasn't just answering questions. She was telling stories, sharing jokes, leaning forward with a kind of urgency that made her small shoulders rise and fall with every movement. Her little hands blurred in the air, her expression shifting from excitement to curiosity to pure amusement in a matter of seconds. It was beautiful, and it hurt. Richard had always told himself he was a good father. He provided. He made sure Sophie never wanted for anything. Toys, clothes, a good school. But as he sat there, a plate of cooling eggs in front of him, he began to wonder if he'd confused giving her things with giving her himself. The sound of Ava's soft laughter brought him back. She'd crouched slightly beside Sophie, watching intently as the girl signed something that made her eyes crinkle with joy. Then Ava responded in kind, her hands deliberate and graceful. Richard caught a fragment of what Ava signed. "Brother." And then she glanced at him, her expression gentler now, tinged with something unspoken. Later, as she refilled his coffee, she leaned closer and spoke quietly, almost as if it were meant only for him. "I had a younger brother," she said. "He was deaf. We lost him a few years ago." Her gaze flicked to Sophie. "I learned sign language for him. I guess it's just stayed with me." Richard didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt small, but he said it anyway, his voice low. Ava gave a little shrug, not to dismiss the loss, but to keep the moment from turning heavy. After breakfast, Sophie signed "thank you" to Ava before they left, her movements crisp and clear. Ava smiled and returned the sign, holding Sophie's gaze just long enough to make it feel like a promise that this wasn't the end of their conversations. Outside, the air was cooler now, a breeze carrying the faint scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Richard and Sophie walked in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. He could feel the gap between them, made all the more obvious by how easily Ava had bridged it. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, he found himself standing in the doorway of her room. She was curled under her blanket, her hands still for once, her breathing slow and steady. He thought of the way her face had lit up when Ava signed to her, the way her entire posture had shifted, from quiet reserve to joyful openness. And for the first time in years, Richard admitted to himself that he was afraid. Afraid that if he didn't change, he'd always be watching Sophie's life from the outside, a silent bystander in his own daughter's story. The following Saturday, Sophie's request wasn't written in her notebook. She simply stood by the door with her shoes on, pointing toward the street and signing café before Richard had even poured his coffee. He didn't hesitate. When they arrived, the café's familiar bell chimed again, and Ava looked up from behind the counter. Her smile widened instantly. She signed, "Good morning," to Sophie before she even greeted Richard. Sophie practically skipped to their usual booth, her small hands already moving in mid-story before she even sat down. Over the next hour, Richard watched their connection deepen in ways he hadn't expected. Ava didn't just ask questions. She taught Sophie new signs, repeating them slowly and patiently until Sophie's movements matched hers. Sometimes she'd add a little twist, a playful exaggeration of emotion, or a funny facial expression, and Sophie would burst into silent laughter, clutching her stomach like it was the best joke she'd ever heard. Richard found himself smiling too, though his was tinged with something quieter. It was like watching someone water a plant you'd forgotten was even in the corner of the room, only to realize it had been waiting all along for just a little care. By their third visit, Ava was no longer just the waitress. She'd become a fixture in Sophie's week, a reason for her to get up early on Saturdays. Richard noticed that Sophie's drawings at home had changed too. Among her usual sketches of animals and flowers, there were now pages with two stick figures, one with curly hair, one with neat braids, signing to each other under bright yellow suns. One morning, as Ava brought over their breakfast, she glanced at Richard and said, "You know, there's a free ASL class at the community center on Wednesday nights." He blinked, surprised. "Oh? You should come," she said, setting the plates down. "Sophie would love it." She gave him a small, knowing smile before returning to the counter. That suggestion stayed with him for the rest of the day. That night, Richard sat at his laptop staring at the community center's website. It had been a long time since he'd started something entirely new. Business ventures were easy. They came with plans, strategies, measurable returns. But this was personal. This was stepping into a space where he wouldn't have the upper hand, where he'd be the one fumbling and learning. Still, he signed up. On the first Wednesday, the room was modest, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, a whiteboard with the alphabet chart in bright colors. Richard sat near the back, feeling strangely self-conscious. But as the instructor began, guiding them through the shapes of each letter, he felt something loosen inside him. It wasn't easy. His fingers didn't move as smoothly as he wanted, and he caught himself glancing at the others to check if he was doing it right. But when the instructor signed "Practice at Home," Richard knew exactly who he'd be practicing with. Wednesday nights quickly became a fixture in Richard's week. At first, he treated the ASL classes like an obligation, something to cross off a list. But as the weeks went by, his hands began to remember the shapes more easily. His fingers moved with a little more confidence, his expressions becoming part of the language instead of just a nervous afterthought. He'd practice at his desk between meetings, tracing invisible letters in the air. Sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the glass wall of his office, awkwardly shaping words to no one, and he'd smile at the absurdity of it. But the thought of Sophie's face, that moment when she'd finally understand what he was saying without hesitation, kept him going. One Saturday morning, about a month after he'd started learning, he decided it was time. Sophie was already at the kitchen table when he came downstairs, her hair messy from sleep, a cup of warm milk in front of her. Normally, their mornings began with him asking if she wanted to go to the cafe, speaking the words, then letting her nod or shake her head. But this time, he stood across from her and slowly, carefully signed, "Good morning. I love you." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then her eyes widened, glistening, and her small hands flew to her mouth. She signed back, quick, fluid, certain. "I love you too." Richard barely had time to react before she was around the table, arms wrapped tight around his waist. He felt her shoulders tremble against him, and he rested his chin on her hair, closing his eyes. It was such a small thing, 3 words, but it felt like he'd just crossed an ocean. At the cafe later that morning, Ava noticed immediately. When Sophie excitedly signed to her father mid-meal and he responded without hesitation, Ava's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She looked at Richard, her expression warm and approving, and signed, "Good job," across the table. That night, Richard found himself dialing Ava's number. "I just wanted to thank you," he said when she answered. "For all of it. For making Sophie feel seen. For giving me the push I needed." There was a pause on the other end, and when Ava spoke, her voice was soft. "You did the work, Richard. I just happened to be there." He hesitated, then added, "I'm making a donation to the cafe's ASL program. Enough to expand it. More classes for the staff. Maybe even community workshops." He could almost hear her smile through the phone. That's going to change a lot of lives. As he hung up, Richard realized something. He'd started this journey for Sophie, but somewhere along the way, it had become about him too, about who he wanted to be, not just as a father, but as a man. By the time spring arrived, the cafe felt different, not in the way a new coat of paint or a menu update might change a place, but in the way people spoke to each other, or rather, signed. When Richard and Sophie walked in that morning, the familiar bell above the door chimed, and Sophie's face lit up. At the counter, another barista, a young man Richard had never seen before, greeted Sophie with a signed, "Good morning." She responded with ease, her movements confident and clear. Around the room, a few other staff members wore small learning ASL pins, their hands occasionally lifting to practice a sign with a customer. Ava appeared from behind the espresso machine, wiping her hands on a towel. She spotted Sophie and immediately signed, "I missed you," before turning to Richard with a playful, "Long time, no see." They made their way to their usual booth, and this time, Richard didn't sit in silence while Sophie and Ava chatted. He joined in. Not perfectly. His hands still stumbled over a few words, and sometimes he had to pause and think. But he was there. He wasn't watching from the outside anymore. Halfway through their meal, Richard caught Sophie watching him. She wasn't looking for mistakes. She wasn't testing him, she was simply smiling, her eyes bright with a pride that went deeper than words. When they finished eating, Ava came by to clear their plates. Richard waited until Sophie had hopped down from the booth, then turned to Ava and signed, "Thank you, for everything." This time, the words didn't feel like borrowed movements. They felt his. Ava's expression softened. She signed back, "You did this," then glanced toward Sophie, who was waiting by the door, swinging her legs as she sat on the windowsill. Outside, the air was warm and fresh, the first true hint of summer. Richard took Sophie's hand, but now it didn't feel like a bridge between separate worlds. It felt like part of the same one. As they walked away from the cafe, Sophie began signing a story. Something about her school art project, complete with exaggerated expressions and little flourishes she'd learned from Ava. Richard kept pace, his own hands moving in reply, their conversation flowing freely down the quiet street. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be.